Hey, how's it going? Welcome to the fourth video on culture and ethnicity. Let's do it. So our three learning goals today are you're going to know about culture in Australia, know what ethnic identity is, and be able to write an extended response. Remember, you should be writing down everything that's in white as notes in your exercise book. So, culture in Australia. There's this idea of a national culture. Cultures started up around countries. Remember that countries are made up, so the idea of a national culture is essentially made up as well. So sometimes a culture is based on a country or a nation. So in 1800s Australian culture, it was still really Anglo-Celtic. So most of the culture that you saw in Australia was based on Britain and Ireland, because that's where most of the people were from. It was based on colonization, the colonizers spreading out across the land, and obviously the country and the people were still ruled by Britain. We didn't become a country until 1901. So here's a few cool pictures from back then. Got some British soldiers there. This here is Adelaide, I think. Check it out. Everyone's got hats on and massive dresses. This is Castlemaine, if you've ever been out there. So look how wide the streets are. Nice. This is one of the gold digging areas, I think, in Victoria. More 1800s Australia. Aussie rules football, loosely based on an indigenous game called Man Grook, if you remember that. And people loved guns, what can I say? Even children. Unacceptable. Okay, cool. So, Australian culture in Australia. After 1945, Australian culture was more Australian. So it was based on what went on in Australia. The reason why we say after 1945, there was a big shift in World War II. Australia, while it became a country of its own in 1901, it was still culturally looked to Britain, the motherland. But then in World War II, when Britain wasn't able to protect Australia militarily, Australia looked more towards the US and to itself. So you definitely see Australian culture from 1945 onwards more Americanized. So it was all about nation building and national hero creation. So obviously Simpson and his donkey, the Anzac myth is a classic example of nation building, the Australian culture. So you'll see in a lot of the time you'll hear the idea that Australia was born from Gallipoli. Here's a quick video about what is ethnicity.
Although the term ethnicity has some clear and consistent overlap with definitions of race, it also differs widely from its more physically or phenotypically defined cousin. Because while race is often a topic of intense conversation, ethnicity can kind of feel like another thing on the long list of identity markers that's confusing to pin down. It turns out that what we've come to determine as ethnicity started with definitions by groups of social scientists in the 1920s before being taken up in common parlance by the mid-20th century. But race and ethnicity have some very interwoven roots, even though they aren't synonymous.
And another video, and this one is next from Crash Course.
How do you define race? If you had to describe why you think you're a member of one race and someone else was a member of a different one, you'd probably focus on appearances. Your skin, your hair, maybe even the structures of your bodies and faces. But most of the time, those physical criteria mean different things depending on the culture you're a part of. An obvious example is skin color. We use the words white and black to describe two races, but the distinction in skin color between those races isn't as clear-cut. A white person who spent the summer at the beach might come home with brown skin, but getting a tan doesn't change their race. And light-skinned black people may have skin that's not all that darker than that tan. Clearly, race is about more than just the literal color of someone's skin.
So here's some 1950s Australia. Sweet cars there. This is from the year 10 history textbook. It's an example of a typical 1950s white Australian lounge room. So you got, it's way more sexist back then. Men usually wore suits and ties to dinner parties. That's lovely. This is the 1960s. There you go. So that's what was happening in the 1960s. Children were generally expected to remain silent unless spoken to. My, how that's changed. Right, so ethnic identity. So ethnic identity is constructed through socialization. So that's the social rules that you're taught from birth. Personal cultural experiences. For example, friends that you meet might be from other ethnicities. You might have some Sri Lankan friends or Malaysian friends who have got a different national culture. And a connection to a shared cultural identity. So maybe your family's Greek or Jewish, or your national culture is of a certain kind, yeah? So ethnic identity is constructed through all three of those things. So when you're defining ethnic identity, you need to mention all three of those things. Means it's time for our reflection activity. I want you to make an analogy. An analogy is trying to describe something in terms of something else. So the analogy I want you to come up with is ethnic identity is like ... and you have to come up with an analogy. So to go back to analogies a bit more, an analogy is used when you're comparing two completely different ideas or things, and you're trying to use the similarities to give an explanation of something that's hard to understand. Yeah. So ethnic identity might be a little bit tricky to understand. If you can come up with an analogy for it, then it will help you to understand it better. So some examples of analogies. Life is like a race. In a race, the person who runs the fastest and continually does so eventually wins. Kind of like in life, especially in the workforce, yeah? If you work hard for a really, really long amount of time, you should succeed. Finally, the moment you've all been waiting for, the homework task. It's to write a practice extended response. If you're in my class, please do that through OneNote. And the extended response topic is explain how race, culture, and ethnicity are different. So remember to answer the question being asked, yeah? So you're going to have to describe what all three of those concepts are, and then you're going to have to draw out the differences between race and culture, culture and ethnicity, and race and ethnicity. Yeah, write a quick plan first, then only spend about 15 minutes on writing it. There's no point us practicing writing massively long extended responses when we're not going to be able to do that under time pressure. But I do want you to remember the extended response template, and I've put it up in this video again to remind you. So, to write an extended response, you should have an introduction where you give your overall view, an overview of the issue, and define the key terms in the topic. So that would be culture, ethnicity, and race. Have 2 or 3 paragraphs, and you can use a little acronym. I've put a little tree emoji there. So it's T, topic, sentence, R, references to key terms, E, evidence, second E, evaluation, and S, sociological theory applied. So if you in any extended response, if you don't know of a sociological theory that applies directly to it, it could still be a good idea to use C. Wright Mills's sociological imagination. In your conclusion, you restate your main argument, summarize the main point, and a quick 1 or 2 sentence reflection on what questions or issues might still exist. So remember, your introduction and your conclusion are just restating your main points. Remember, answer the question being asked, as I was going on about before. Remember, I would say the most common problem with people's extended responses is that they write great stuff, it's all true, it's all interesting, but it's not directly answering the question, yeah? You're only going to get marks for answering the question directly. Thank you very much. Bye.